Hello, I'm Pastor Nanette Christofferson, and along with Pastor Steve Talmadge, we offer these short Bible studies on our lectionary readings. Today, our Old Testament reading is Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, and Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And the commentary is by Juliana Claessens from 2014. Before we get started, I'd like us just to start thinking about Genesis, and it's the beginning of everything. And many times when we get to the story that we have today, the account we have today of Adam and Eve, we already have some predisposition, some pre-ideas of what this text is all about. And oftentimes it's easier just to fall back on what we think it's about than to maybe think about in broader terms of what it's really about. So let's take a look and let's go back to the beginning. When you think of the Garden of Eden, what do you think of? Do you think that it was this absolutely perfect place? Some people might believe that it was perfect. My second question is, do you believe that it was perfect? Well, if we look back to the creation story and see what God was telling us, God created the world and said it was good. He didn't say it was perfect. He said it was good. So when we look back and oftentimes think back to the Garden of Eden, we think that it's this perfect place. But if we look to the readings of it, we see that God created man to till the Garden of Eden, to work in the Garden of Eden. It's not this place where they just sat and ate fruit and were merry all the time. So I think that that's important to kind of let go of perhaps that myth that we've often put on this text. Let's look at our text for today, and I invite you to actually read through some of the verses that are in between here that the lectionary leaves out. But let's take a look at Genesis 2, 15 to 17, and then Genesis 3, 1 through 7. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." Now the serpent, who was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made, he said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves." And I ask the question, have these passages been misunderstood? And I think perhaps maybe they have been at times. The lectionary reading for this first Sunday of Lent has often suffered from some serious misconceptions and misinterpretations. First, consider the woman is to blame. Interpretation according to which Eve is considered to be the weaker sex and thus susceptible to the snake's theories, in addition to being a temptress herself, so leading her innocent husband astray, has been greatly harmful to many women. And if we look at the text, that is not how the text reads. The man was with her. Adam was with her. She didn't tempt him and say, "Oh, you eat too." She handed him the apple and he ate. It's easy to look at this text and allow past history, past ideas to infiltrate and misguide us. So when did we start blaming Eve for all of this? Juliana Claessens writes this: "The nadir of such interpretations is to be found in the 15th century document Malleus Maleficarum that has been used to condemn women accused of witchcraft. This ill-fated document cites that women were, from their creation, imperfect and lustful beings who posed grave dangers to men, and consequently served as the source for witchcraft, thereby providing the basis for 2 centuries of persecutions of thousands of presumed witches." So when we look to Adam and Eve, is even the right question to ask, who's to blame? Phyllis Tribble has shown in her book, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, that Genesis 2-3 depicts male and female as equals, connected to each other. If we look to the reference bone from bone and flesh from flesh in Genesis 2:23, they are also equal in responsibility, in judgment, in shame and guilt, in redemption and grace. What the text says about the woman is also said about the man. Both hide from God and both are punished. So let's talk about the snake for a minute. A second misinterpretation regards viewing the serpent in this text as Satan or the devil. Such an interpretation is a serious anachronism, as the notion of the representation of evil in terms of Satan or devil is a much later phenomena that occurred or that originated with the help of Persian influence. In the ancient Near East, the snake was often associated with wisdom and the human potential for discernment. It is telling, though, that in Genesis 3:1, the serpent is not described as wise, but as crafty. The cunning serpent brings alienation that affects the relationship between humans and their God. A third misinterpretation regards the notion of original sin in the sense of the flawed nature inherited from the first parents by all human beings. We can think of Adam and Eve for this. But Biddle writes that often it's associated with this week's lectionary text. But Mark Biddle says in his book on sin, Missing the Mark, shows how this later dogmatic concept cannot be derived from a text like Genesis 2-3. Biddle rather proposes that Genesis 3 is the story of the human condition that is complex and paradoxical in nature. Moreover, instead of viewing this text in terms of a fall from original essential humanity, one would be better served to view this text in terms of humans' failure to develop into the fullness of being human. The man and the woman who were in Genesis 2:25, oblivious of their nakedness, in Genesis 3:8 find themselves hiding from God because they are ashamed of their nakedness. The moment they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they realized something of their profound sense of vulnerability that is associated with the human condition. However, this shame also brings a sense of distrust between God and humans, as well as humans among one another. This sense of shame is related to the failure of these individuals to accept that they are made in the image and likeness of God. Viewed in this way, sin may be understood as the fearful avoidance of human potential. So what kind of knowledge did they gain? Well, in this text we see some ironic reflection on the disassociation between knowledge, wisdom, and life. After eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the man and the woman indeed gained knowledge when it says in Genesis 3:7 that their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. Moreover, they draw on the knowledge of sewing fig leaves in order to cover their nakedness. William Brown argues, though, that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, without the accompanying tree of life, offers only a partial damning knowledge, an awareness of further lack. So when they eat a forbidden fruit, their eyes are opened like the snake said it would, but rather than becoming like God, knowing good and evil, their partial knowledge is lacking in wisdom. In a contemporary context, one can see how much misery is caused by this disassociation of knowledge and life. One may, for instance, have the knowledge to build an atom bomb, but what is the effect on life? One may have the knowledge to hack a computer or to make a lot of money at the expense of others, but how is this conducive to life? True wisdom is thus to hold on to knowledge that leads to life. If we further read this story in Genesis 2:3, with its theme of human frailty that is so fitting in the time of Lent, we notice the compelling portrayal of God's grace amidst the depravity. So we read in Genesis 3:21 how God sewed garments of skin for Adam and Eve, this act of clothing the fragile and flawed human beings serving as a powerful symbol of God's provision. Thus, in spite of the frailty, the shame, and the precarious nature of the human condition outlined in this text, one sees a powerful witness of a God who continues to remain in relationship with God's creatures. When we look to this text of Adam and Eve, we often think that it's about temptation. But perhaps it's really more about our humanness and our failure to grow in our humanness. We can oversimplify this story, and it's easy to do that. And obviously, it has been done and misinterpreted, oftentimes at the sake of women. But I believe that as we look to this text, we can see the truth in it, that God wasn't pitting one against the other or trying to show that Eve was the weak one. God was showing us that both were frail, both are vulnerable, and both, as we all do, oftentimes lack trust in God's faithfulness. I hope you have an opportunity to think about this beginning story for a while this week, and to kind of sit in it and to think about God's faithfulness, especially as we look over the history of time and how God's faithfulness has always been true, always been patient, always been steadfast, always been slow to anger, and always been a God of love. May you have a wonderful week this week as we enter into Ash Wednesday and our first week of Lent.